Because I'm actually a little bit more nervous today than last time, which surprises me. But it has to do with a couple of things that we're going to get into after those questions, which is very special and shocking but not surprising. But we'll get into that.
There are cases that never fade from public memory, names that linger like an open wound. Madeleine McCann is one of them. Nearly 2 decades have passed, yet whenever her name surfaces, it brings with it the same sense of unease. Not because the truth has been revealed, but because the truth remains hidden. What makes this case so haunting is not only the disappearance of a 3-year-old child, but the countless contradictions, the testimonies that don't align, and the fragments of a story that never truly fit together. It is often said that when a story is true, the details may blur with time, but its foundation remains intact. When a story is false, however, cracks appear quickly. In the case of Madeleine McCann, those cracks were visible everywhere, in witness accounts, in the shifting timeline, even in the strange imagery of dreams. These cracks became the entry point for suspicion, fueling the belief that behind the official version lay another, darker truth. On that night in Praia da Luz, Portugal, May 3, 2007, the alarm was raised. A child had vanished from her family's holiday apartment. From that moment onward, a storm of media coverage and speculation engulfed the world. But beneath the polished press conferences and the carefully constructed statements, something felt wrong. Witnesses contradicted one another. Timelines refused to hold together. Even small details, a door left open or closed, the sound of a child crying, a figure glimpsed in the shadows, became battlegrounds of dispute. One witness swore she had seen a man with an oval, bald head carrying a child across the street. Months later, she changed her story. It was no longer a bald man, but a bundle wrapped in fabric. Another family, initially uncertain, years later claimed with absolute conviction that the man they saw resembled Jerry McCann himself, the child's father. Human memory does not sharpen with age, it erodes. And yet, here were accounts growing more detailed over time, defying the natural laws of recollection. The McCann's friends, the so-called Tapas 7, were supposed to provide a rock-solid alibi, a synchronized account of that evening. Instead, their testimonies shifted like sand. Who checked the children and when? Which door was locked? Which was left open? Some details lined up almost too perfectly, while others clashed with no resolution. Even the nanny's testimony about hearing a child cry changed over time, softening in ways that seemed less like memory and more like revision. It is this pattern, not one mistake, but mistake after mistake at crucial junctures, that made the case impossible to ignore. And it was here that an outsider stepped into the void. Bert Stellander. He was not a detective, not part of the official investigation, yet he became a relentless voice challenging the official story. Stellander's belief was simple. The truth is not found in polished narratives, but in the fractures where stories fall apart. What you are about to hear is not a verdict, nor a definitive solution to the case. It is a journey into those fractures, the contradictions, the altered memories, the theories built and dismantled. It is unsettling because it does not offer closure. Instead, it compels us to look at the places where words collide and details betray themselves. For Stellander, and for many who still follow this case, it is in those cracks that the truth struggles to break through. Every mystery begins with a single moment of uncertainty. And in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, that moment came in the form of a sighting. Jane Tanner, one of the McCann's friends, claimed she saw a man carrying a small child across the street near the apartment that night. At first, her description was sharp and memorable. She spoke of a man with an oval-shaped bald head, a faceless silhouette that soon came to be known in the press as the Eggman. It was an image that burned itself into public memory, a shadowy figure, bald and menacing, walking off into the night with a child in his arms. But months later, something strange happened. Tanner's story shifted. The man she once described so clearly no longer had a bald, egg-like head. Now she said he carried what looked like a bundle, wrapped in fabric. In forensic psychology, this kind of shift is a red flag. Memories can fade, yes. Details can grow hazy under stress, but memories do not normally transform into something completely different. A face becoming a bundle? That was more than the erosion of time. To many, it was a sign of external pressure, a subconscious reshaping of memory to fit a new narrative. And Jane Tanner was not alone in her contradictions. Another family, the Smiths from Ireland, reported that they too saw a man carrying a child that night. At first, they were cautious. They described what they had seen, but admitted they could not identify who the man was. For years, their testimony remained in the background, another possible but unconfirmed lead. Then, something remarkable occurred. Years later, after Jerry McCann had appeared in the media countless times, his face known across the world, the Smiths suddenly declared they were certain. The man they saw that night looked exactly like Jerry himself. This change sparked immediate controversy. How could a vague memory, uncertain and hesitant in the beginning, suddenly crystallize into absolute conviction years later? Human memory does not improve with age. It weakens. Psychological research shows that fleeting encounters are among the least reliable memories of all. Over time, they blur, and the mind unconsciously fills the gaps. For critics, the Smiths' newfound certainty was proof that their recollection had been contaminated by the media. The endless repetition of Jerry's face on television had fused with their memory, rewriting what they thought they had seen. For others, however, the claim was damning. If the Smiths were right, then Jerry McCann himself had been the man carrying Madeleine that night. 2 witnesses, 2 sightings, both critical to the timeline of events, and yet both riddled with contradictions. Each change, each inconsistency, may have seemed small on its own, but together they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. These contradictions were not just academic debates. They went to the heart of the case. Was Madeleine carried out of the apartment by a stranger, as the official narrative suggested? Or was the image of a man in the night something far more personal, a father, not an intruder? It is here that the story begins to unravel, because if witnesses could not provide a consistent description, then the foundation of the abduction narrative started to crack, and once cracks appear, they spread. Stellander and others who doubted the official version argued that these contradictions were not random mistakes, but signals, signs that the story being told was not anchored in truth. They believed the discrepancies revealed pressure, rehearsal, and perhaps even guilt. To them, the changing descriptions were not about the fragility of memory. They were about the fragility of a lie. And if the witness accounts already faltered, what about the group at the center of it all? The McCann's closest friends, the Tapas 7. Their testimonies were meant to strengthen the case. Instead, they only deepened the confusion. When investigators pieced together the events of May 3, 2007, they turned to the group of friends who had dined with the McCanns that night. Known as the Tapas 7, these friends were supposed to provide clarity. They had shared the same restaurant table, walked the same paths back and forth to their apartments, and witnessed the same night unfold. If anyone could give investigators a solid, synchronized account, it was them. But when their statements were compared side by side, what was meant to be an airtight narrative quickly unraveled. Instead of consistency, police found contradictions at every turn. The first problem was timing. According to the group, they had developed a routine of checking on their children at intervals throughout the evening. Yet, when pressed on exactly who went to check and when, the answers became tangled. One friend said Jerry McCann left the table at a certain time. Another insisted it was later. A third claimed she saw him return almost immediately, while someone else remembered the gap as much longer. These shifting minutes might sound trivial, but in cases like this, timing is everything. A child does not vanish into thin air. The exact moment Madeleine was last seen alive was critical. If the group could not provide a coherent timeline, then the chain of events became unstable. Each version of the story slipped and slid like sand, never settling into a fixed sequence. Then came the matter of the doors. Some members of the group insisted the patio doors were used to enter and exit the apartment. Others claimed the front door was locked and unlocked several times. Kate McCann herself later stated she found the bedroom door in a position that did not match earlier descriptions. These were not small discrepancies. They cut to the core of the case. How could an intruder have entered? And if the apartment was truly secure, how did Madeleine disappear? The contradictions extended further. The nanny who supervised the children had originally said she heard Madeleine crying on a previous night, distressed and inconsolable. Later, her testimony softened. The detail slipped, reframed, as if memory itself had been reshaped to suit a less troubling version of events. To outside observers, these inconsistencies may have looked like the ordinary chaos of memory under stress. People misremember, trauma clouds perception. But to skeptics, the pattern was too precise to dismiss. The contradictions always appeared at the most crucial points. The timeline of checks, the use of doors, the sound of a child in distress. Investigators know a simple truth. When friends tell the same story too perfectly, it raises suspicions of collusion. But when friends tell inconsistent stories, it suggests deception. The top of 7 seemed caught in the middle. Sometimes their accounts sounded rehearsed. Sometimes they fractured entirely. Either way, their words could not be trusted at face value. This uncertainty fed into Stellander's growing conviction. To him, the top of 7 were not confused parents scrambling to recall a tragic night. They were participants in a performance, struggling to keep the script straight. The rehearsal notes, the shifting details, the contradictions, all of it suggested not chaos, but calculation. And yet, critics argued there was another explanation. In the panic of a missing child, memory fragments, emotions blur, and the desperate attempt to reconstruct events produces contradictions. Perhaps these parents were simply overwhelmed, their minds grasping at order in the fog of shock. But whether the inconsistencies were born of confusion or deception, the result was the same. The official timeline could not be trusted, and without a trustworthy timeline, the narrative of abduction began to collapse. For Stellander and others, this collapse was not accidental. It was the natural unraveling of a story that had never been true to begin with. For investigators and skeptics alike, the contradictions meant one thing above all. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann could not be explained by the neat version of events offered that night. Something darker, something unspoken, lay beneath. In almost every great mystery, there emerges a symbol, an image that lingers long after the details have faded. In the case of Madeleine McCann, one of the most unsettling symbols came not from police reports or forensic evidence, but from a dream. Kate McCann, in her memoir and later interviews, described what she called the turning point dream. In it, she saw her daughter lying still on a large flat slab of stone. Dreams are slippery things. Psychologists will tell you they are the mind's attempt to process trauma, fragments of memory reshaped into images. But for many, Kate's description felt uncomfortably specific. Why a slab of stone? Why an image so tied to the landscape around Praia de Luz, with its rocky hills and gray outcrops? For skeptics of the official narrative, the dream was not simply grief. It was revelation. Bert Stellander seized on this imagery and transformed it into one of his most controversial theories. He argued that Kate's subconscious had betrayed her, that the dream was not invention, but memory leaking through. To him, the stone slab was a clue, evidence that Madeleine's body had once rested on rock. Stellander investigated the terrain surrounding the resort and claimed he found formations that matched the dream. Wide, flat stones jutting out of the hillside like natural tables. It was too close, he said, to be coincidence. And the dream was only the beginning. The second thread came from Jerry McCann's daily habit. During their stay, Jerry was known to go running. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it, a father keeping fit on holiday. But Stellander believed Jerry's routes often led him toward the very hill where Kate's dreams seemed to point. What if those runs were not simply exercise? What if they doubled as reconnaissance, an opportunity to visit or conceal his daughter's body without raising suspicion? The theory grew darker still. Stellander claimed he had planted a hidden camera overlooking the hill, and that it captured footage of Jerry, or someone resembling him, acting suspiciously in the area. To Stellander, this was the smoking gun, visual proof that the hill was central to the case. Yet, he never released the footage. He hinted at legal obstacles, injunctions, and suppression. Skeptics saw this as the fatal flaw. How can anyone believe in evidence that never sees the light of day? Despite this, the hill theory caught fire in the public imagination. The imagery was too powerful to dismiss. A grieving mother dreaming of her child on stone. A father running toward a lonely rise. A researcher claiming to hold secret footage. It had all the ingredients of a revelation waiting to be uncovered. And yet, when examined closely, the theory cracked under its own weight. The hill was not remote. Tourists often walked its paths. Locals knew its terrain. Hiding a body there would have been extraordinarily risky, especially for educated parents who understood that the earliest days of an investigation are the most intense. If concealment were the goal, there were far more discreet options: wells, abandoned buildings, even the ocean. Why choose a hill in plain sight? Critics also warned against treating dreams as evidence. A dream, no matter how vivid, is not a map. It reflects stress, grief, fear, not necessarily reality. To anchor an entire theory on a dream, then reinforce it with unseen footage, stretched credibility to breaking point. Still, the divide was unmistakable. To supporters, the theory's consistency was compelling. The dream, the rocks, the runs, each thread fragile on its own, but together forming a tapestry too striking to ignore. To detractors, it was classic confirmation bias. Start with a dream, find a hill that fits, and then interpret ordinary jogs as something sinister. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What is undeniable is the effect. Even without proof, the hill theory etched itself into public consciousness. It painted a cinematic picture: Madeleine on a slab of stone, a father jogging into the heat of the Portuguese sun, a lonely hill holding a secret. These images endure precisely because they are haunting, because they can be visualized. And in a case starved of closure, imagery can sometimes feel more real than evidence. But here lies the sobering truth. No remains have ever been found on that hill. No DNA, no forensic trace, no footage released. All that exists are words. Kate's words about a dream, Bert's words about a tape, critics' words about logic. In a court of law, words alone do not convict. But in the court of public imagination, words can be stronger than facts. And that is why the hill theory, as flawed as it may be, remains one of the most divisive chapters in the saga of Madeleine McCann. For most of the world, the story of Madeleine McCann begins on the night of May 3rd, 2007. That was the evening when Kate McCann raised the alarm, when the resort erupted in chaos, when the international press turned its cameras on a sleepy Portuguese town. But for Bert Stellander, the story did not begin there. He believed the critical date was not May 3rd, but May 2nd, the night before. According to Stellander, Madeleine did not vanish on May 3rd. She died on the evening of May 2nd. Everything that followed, the dinner, the checks, the frantic alarm, was a carefully staged performance designed to convince the world that the tragedy had struck a day later. It was a radical claim, but like all radical claims, it rested on details that, once seen, were difficult to ignore. At the heart of Stellander's argument were a set of handwritten notes, often referred to as the timelines. These were drafted by members of the Tapas 7 in the aftermath of Madeleine's disappearance. To a casual reader, they looked like rough attempts to reconstruct a confusing night. Lists of who checked on which child, at what time, with gaps filled in and corrections made. But to Stellander, they were not spontaneous recollections at all. He called them rehearsal sheets. Think about that word, rehearsal. It suggests preparation, not memory, performance, not reaction. In Stellander's analysis, the very existence of multiple drafts showed that the group was practicing a version of events, smoothing rough edges, aligning stories, ensuring consistency before speaking to police. The discrepancies between the drafts, different times, different people assigned to the checks, were not innocent mistakes. They were the fingerprints of a narrative under construction. This raised a chilling question. Why would a group of educated adults, many of them doctors, feel the need to create rehearsal sheets unless there was something to hide? If the story was simple, that they dined, checked their children, and discovered one missing, then each could simply state what they remembered. The truth does not require rehearsal. Lies do. To Stellander, the logic was brutal. If Madeleine had died on May the 2nd, then the group needed to push her death forward into May 3rd in order to sustain the illusion of abduction. The checks, the timelines, the dinner itself became part of a play. A performance designed not for themselves, but for the outside world. Neighbors, police, the press. Critics countered with another explanation. The night was chaotic. The parents were distraught. In the fog of panic, it was natural to try to reconstruct events in writing. The timelines, they argued, were desperate attempts to make sense of confusion, not rehearsals for a lie. People misremember times, especially under stress. To them, the notes were evidence of human frailty, not deception. Yet, Stellander was not convinced. He pointed to the structure of the notes. They did not look like panicked fragments. They looked like charts with precise minutes assigned, as if the group were building a clockwork version of the night. Real panic produces chaos. Real memory produces approximations. But these notes, he argued, were too clean, too deliberate. If Stellander was right, the implications were devastating. The Tapa 7 were not simply covering for a lapse in judgment. They were constructing an alternate reality, a parallel version of May 3rd, rehearsed and repeated until it felt natural. And if Madeleine had died on May 2nd, then the official story, the abduction, the alarm, the search, was theater. This interpretation reframed everything. The checks, once seen as parental vigilance, became scripted beats in a drama. The frantic movements back and forth between the restaurant and the apartments were not about safety, but about performance. They were not parents acting out of responsibility, but actors playing their roles. For critics of Stellander, the theory was an overreach. Without forensic evidence tying Madeleine's death to May the 2nd, it was speculation piled on speculation. A dream, some notes, and an interpretation of behavior. Was that enough to rewrite the calendar of a crime? Perhaps not. But to Stellander's supporters, the rehearsal sheets were the most revealing artifacts in the entire case. They were the scaffolding of deception, never meant to be seen by the public, accidentally preserved as evidence of a performance that collapsed under scrutiny. And so, the May the 2nd theory, like the Hill theory before it, sits in the gray space between belief and doubt. To some, it is the master key. To others, a distraction. But one thing is undeniable. The rehearsal notes exist. They were written. They bear the marks of coordination. Whether innocent or sinister, they show that something unusual was happening behind the scenes, and they leave us with the question that haunts the case more than any other. Was Madeleine's disappearance the tragedy of May 3rd, or the secret of May 2nd, rehearsed until the world believed? If Stellander's May 2nd theory was correct, if Madeleine had died a day earlier than the world was told, then a darker question followed. Where was her body? For him, the answer lay not in a single location, but in movement. He called it the chain of concealment, a shifting path that explained why investigators, despite years of searching, never found Madeleine. The first link in that chain was the apartment itself. Cadaver dogs brought into 5A detected the strongest scent of death behind the living room sofa. To Stellander, this was no coincidence. He believed it was the first place Madeleine's body had rested. Temporary, crude, but immediate. If her death had been sudden, accidental or otherwise, there would have been no time to think. The sofa was the closest place to put her before panic gave way to planning. The second link was the scrubland outside the resort. Once the initial shock passed, Stellander argued, the body had to be moved. Leaving it inside the apartment was too dangerous. Concealing her in the brush would have bought time, hiding incriminating evidence from investigators while the narrative of abduction began to take shape. The wild terrain, with its uneven ground and scattered rocks, could shield a body temporarily, long enough for a new plan to form. But concealment in scrubland could not last. And so, Stellander claimed, the body was moved again, this time to a local cemetery. Hidden inside a heavy stone casket, it would have been nearly impossible to discover. To him, this explained Kate's dream of Madeleine lying on a slab of rock. It was not imagination, but memory. A subconscious echo of where her daughter had been placed. Stone, heavy and silent, became both symbol and hiding place. The final link in Stellander's chain was perhaps the most controversial of all. The rental car. Weeks after Madeleine's disappearance, the McCanns hired a Renault Scenic. By then, international attention had softened, the family preparing to return home. For Stellander, this was the opportunity to move her body one last time, out of Portugal, away from suspicion. Forensic tests on the car revealed 15 of 19 DNA markers matching Madeleine. It was not a complete profile, but it was close enough to ignite suspicion. Combined with cadaver scent detected in the trunk, Stellander and his supporters saw this as confirmation that the car had carried her remains. Critics, however, were unconvinced. Moving a body multiple times was an enormous risk. Every transfer increased exposure. Every shift raised the chance of discovery. Why would educated parents already under intense scrutiny choose such a dangerous strategy? Why not simply hide her once, in a remote location, and be done? For skeptics, the chain of concealment was too elaborate, too cinematic, the product of confirmation bias rather than logic. This is where Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is often the correct one, cuts deep. Portugal is filled with wells, ravines, and even the vast ocean only minutes away. To critics, these options made far more sense than a complicated sequence involving sofas, cemeteries, and cars. Complexity comforts us because it suggests intelligence and design, but often the truth is brutally simple. And yet, Stellander's chain had one undeniable power. It explained why the case remained unresolved. A body constantly moved is a body that leaves no stable trail. It made sense of why the cadaver dogs alerted in multiple places, why DNA traces were partial, why suspicion lingered without closure. It gave form to the absence. But here lies the haunting reality. Madeleine has never been found. No body, no definitive forensic proof, no confession. The chain of concealment, whether elaborate truth or speculative fiction, remains only a story that reflects less about what happened and more about how desperate we are to connect the fragments into something coherent. In the end, the chain is not just about Madeleine, it is about us, our need for detail, for a sequence we can follow, for a narrative that feels complete, even if that narrative is flawed, even if it may not be true. By the time Stellander had presented his theories, two competing explanations for Madeleine's disappearance had taken shape. Both ended with concealment. Both painted a picture of parents making desperate choices, but the difference lay in motive, and in what kind of people Jerry and Kate McCann truly were. Stellander's view was uncompromising. To him, Madeleine's death was not an accident at all, but the result of something darker: misconduct. He argued that the McCanns had faced the discovery of a truth so devastating it would destroy their careers, reputations, and freedom. Exposure, he said, meant prison. Concealment, on the other hand, meant survival. The abduction narrative was not simply a shield against negligence, but a weapon, a carefully crafted story that transformed them from suspects into victims, from potential criminals into grieving parents worthy of global sympathy. The psychology of survival was central to this theory. Stellander believed that once the McCanns realized what was at stake, concealment was not a choice, but a necessity. If misconduct were revealed, they would lose not just their daughter, but everything: their medical licenses, their children, their social standing. In that light, even the unthinkable, hiding the death of your own child, could begin to feel like the only possible course. But there was another, less sinister possibility, one that others, including the narrator of this investigation, found more plausible. It was the theory of medication. As doctors, Jerry and Kate lived in a world where pharmaceuticals were solutions, not dangers. It was not unusual in their professional culture to use sedatives to help children sleep. Perhaps on that holiday evening, in their desire to enjoy dinner with friends, they gave their children something to keep them quiet through the night. What if the dosage was too high? What if Madeleine was already vulnerable? The line between sleep and tragedy can be razor thin. A child can slip from drowsiness into unconsciousness, even respiratory failure, with terrifying speed. In this version, Madeleine's death was not premeditated misconduct, but a miscalculation, a tragic accident born of poor judgment. This theory, too, aligns with pieces of evidence: the cadaver dogs alerting inside the apartment, the scent behind the sofa, the frantic creation of timelines, the partial DNA in the rental car. All of it could be explained without conspiracy, without misconduct, only a desperate cover-up of a terrible mistake. The distinction between these two theories is crucial because it shapes how the world views the McCanns. If it was misconduct, they become predators hiding behind the facade of medicine and respectability. If it was a medication accident, they are negligent but not monsters. Parents whose arrogance in thinking they could control sleep through drugs ended in disaster. One version invites sympathy, however limited. The other demands condemnation. Yet both theories converge on the same unsettling truth: concealment. Whether through panic or calculation, fear or guilt, the McCanns, in this view, chose deception over confession. They staged timelines, polished interviews, repeated their story until it sounded unshakable. Once the machinery of concealment was set in motion, there was no turning back. A single lie became many. A single cover-up expanded into a performance replayed for the world. And that is perhaps the most disturbing part of this case. Not only that, Madeleine may have died in circumstances hidden from the public, but that what followed was a sustained effort to erase the truth. Even if the initial act was negligence, the aftermath was deception. And deception corrodes trust as deeply as the crime itself. For the public, the choice between the two theories remains unresolved. Some see misconduct and recoil, others see a medication accident and grimly nod. But beneath both lies the same chilling logic. When identity, freedom, and reputation are threatened, human beings are capable of extraordinary lengths to protect themselves, even against their own child. Few figures outside the family have stirred as much debate in the Madeleine McCann case as Bert Stellander. To some, he was the lone voice willing to challenge the official story, a relentless investigator who refused to be silenced. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man who mistook speculation for fact and became trapped inside his own obsession. Whether hero or deluded, his name became woven into the narrative of this mystery. At the height of his influence, Stellander's theories reached millions. His early podcasts went viral, his calm delivery and meticulous notes giving listeners the sense that he had uncovered hidden truths. For a brief moment, he was a rallying point for those who doubted the abduction narrative. Criminal profilers and activists praised his work, seeing in him a kindred spirit who dared to say the unsayable. But momentum did not last. His later projects faltered, viewership collapsed, mainstream media turned away. Stellander insisted that injunctions and legal pressures silenced him, that evidence he possessed could not be released. To his supporters, this made sense. The system was suppressing the truth. To his critics, it was further proof of delusion. Evidence that cannot be shown, they argued, is no evidence at all. This tension reveals the paradox of Stellander's legacy. On one hand, his persistence was remarkable. In a landscape where many critics retreated under pressure, he stood firm, absorbing ridicule and dwindling audiences, yet refusing to abandon his claims. Such determination is rare, and it explains why some still call him courageous. On the other hand, consistency is not proof. Refusing to change one's mind in the face of weak evidence can be stubbornness masquerading as conviction. What began as inquiry risked hardening into dogma. And yet, Stellander did leave a mark. His emphasis on contradictions, his focus on rehearsal notes, his haunting hill theory, all of these threads seeped into public imagination. They gave people images to hold on to: a child on stone, a father jogging to a hill, a secret written into shifting timelines. These details were cinematic, unforgettable. Even without proof, they lingered. Why do people still believe him? The answer lies less in his evidence than in human psychology. We are creatures of narrative. We crave stories more than statistics, imagery more than ambiguity. A dream of a child on stone feels more revelatory than a police report saying, "No conclusion can be drawn." A hidden camera, even one never revealed, feels more powerful than an empty file. Stellander provided what official investigations could not: a sense of meaning in the chaos. This is why conspiracy theories thrive, why myths endure. Ambiguity is unbearable. Certainty, even when fragile, feels like safety. In Stellander's defiance, in his refusal to hedge his words, people found comfort. He did not whisper, "We don't know." He declared, he insisted, and that confidence was magnetic. But here is the sobering reality. After nearly 2 decades, no one has been convicted. No body has ever been found. No definitive evidence has surfaced. All that remains are theories: the misconduct theory, the medication accident theory, the hill, the timelines, the chain of concealment. Each explanation is compelling in its own way, and each carries the same flaw: no proof. This absence is the essence of the case. It is why the world cannot let it go. Evidence usually brings closure: a body recovered, a confession obtained, a trace of DNA that seals the story. But in the McCann case, silence itself became the story. Silence and the vacuum it created, filled with speculation, imagery, and endless debate. Perhaps this is why the case endures. Madeleine is no longer only a missing child. She has become a symbol of uncertainty, of distrust, of the human need for answers. Stellander's work, whether right or wrong, reflected that need. He embodied the refusal to accept silence as final. And so the question lingers, like an echo in an empty room. What truly happened to Madeleine McCann? Was she taken by a stranger? Was it an accident hidden in panic? Was she carried to the hills, to the sea, to somewhere no one has yet thought to look? Each theory offers an answer. Each draws believers, and none can close the wound. The truth exists. It cannot be destroyed. It may be hidden, buried, silenced, or denied, but it endures. And until the day it is unearthed, the world will keep asking. Because silence is not closure. Silence is only delay.